So for this first section, we are going to be talking about how to add signed numbers. So signed numbers is just meaning we're going to be adding positive and negative numbers. So you're going to be working with integers. We're going to be working with integers pretty much this entire chapter. So for today, we're going to get into adding. We'll then do subtracting separately, and then we'll do multiplying and dividing. And then we'll also just talk about powers of 10. And powers of 10 are just moving decimals again. So multiplying and dividing by those. So integers would be your positive and your negative numbers. And the opposite of something would be the same number, but it changes its sign. So opposites would be like 5 and negative 5. So they're the same distance away from 0 on the number line. If you're trying to compare two signed numbers, if you need to, think about like where they would be on the number line. It's fairly easy if you're looking at like a negative and a positive, because we all know that positive numbers are always bigger than negative. But if you're looking at like two negative numbers, that's where I sometimes see mistakes happen more, because a lot of times students will see the larger number and they just automatically assume that's the bigger one. But if you're dealing with negatives, a larger negative number is actually farther away from 0. So you have to kind of think about which number would be closer to 0 on the number line. So you're going to be using those symbols less than and greater than. So think about maybe when you learned about less and greater than for the first time, like the alligator eats the larger number. So you're using those when you're trying to compare numbers. Okay, so I want you guys to look at 1, 2, 3, 4 there. I want you to write down the appropriate less than or greater than sign. The first one you think is less than? What's the next one? Greater. Next one? Less than. And last? Less. Okay? So getting into negative numbers, we talk about something called absolute value, which you've probably heard before. I know we talked about in Algebra 1 at least. Absolute value is talking about distance from 0. Absolute value, especially when you talk about distance, is always positive. So when the number on the inside is negative, absolute value basically undoes the negative part and makes it become positive. If it's already positive, it stays positive. So don't be changing positives to negatives. But we're talking about distance from 0, and distance can't be negative. Okay, whether you drive forward for 5 miles or you drive backward for 5 miles, you're still adding mileage to your car. You don't erase miles by driving backwards. So distance is always positive. So if the number inside is already positive, it stays positive. So this one's just going to stay 9. If this one's negative, though, it's going to become positive. So it becomes positive 4. The additive inverse, this is one of our basic properties when we're talking about numbers. Additive inverse means that you take a number and you add it to its opposite, and they basically cancel each other out and you get a 0. So when you think about, again, those numbers on a number line, if they're the same distance apart, if I wanted them to meet in the middle, they would meet at 0 on the number line. So in order to find the additive inverse, it's got the same number value, so you're not changing the number at all, you're just changing the sign of it. So if it's positive, it turns to negative. If it's negative, it turns to positive. Okay, so take a second and by yourself in your notes, write down the opposites of these 3 numbers. And then they do want you to show your answer on the number line. So that just means draw like a small number line here. 0 should be in the middle. And I want to see you guys place the number that they give you and then its opposite. So what's the opposite of negative 8? Positive 8. So then if I wanted to put those on the number line, I would put negative 8 on the left side of 0, positive 8 on the right side of 0. Opposite of 6? Negative 6. So Negative 6 goes to the left, positive 6 goes to the right. Now what about 0? Stays the same. So it's kind of a trick question here. 0 doesn't really have an opposite because there's no such thing as negative 0. So when you see a 0, it doesn't have an opposite technically. And since it doesn't have an opposite, we're not going to worry about graphing this one either because you would just be looking at 0. There would be nothing else to compare it to. Okay, so we're going to get into adding now. So adding numbers, if they have like signs, you add the numbers like normal. So you do 2 plus 3. And if they're both positive, you keep it positive. If they're both negative, you keep it negative. Okay? So for 12 and negative 5, I'm trying to add those. I take 12 plus 5, which would be 17. And the negative sign just follows. If you've got multiple numbers, like number 2, you've got negative 3 plus negative 4 plus negative 1. You just, again, add all of your numbers. So you're going to do 3 plus 4 plus 1, which would be 8. They're all negative, so your final answer should be negative 8. The same thing would happen if those were all positive numbers. They just happen to give you examples that only have negatives involved. Now they also go into adding numbers that have unlike signs. So if you're trying to add a positive and a negative together. Now they say that what you should do is take like the absolute values, which you can, but a lot of times, like what you probably were taught when you were first learning how to add and subtract integers, is you take a look at the numbers. If they're opposite signs, you're actually subtracting them, and then you just take the sign of the larger number. So 7 and negative 12, what I would do is take like 12 minus 7, or you can rewrite this as 7 minus 12. And so you're going to get negative 5 if you do 7 minus 12, or 12 minus 7 would be 5, but then you take the negative because 12 had a negative sign to begin with. So that's where that negative came from. So really either way is okay to do with subtracting. So what would be negative 5 plus 7? Positive 2. Now on the next page, if they give you something that's got a lot of negatives and positives that you're trying to add them all together, what you could do first is just combine things that have like signs. So let's add 8 and 13 together. And then let's do the ones with the negatives separately. So negative 9 plus negative 15. So 8 plus 13 is going to be 21. Negative 9 plus negative 15 is going to be negative 24. So we're taking 21 plus negative 24. What's that going to give me? Negative 3. Now you don't have to do that. You could just add them in order. You could take 8 plus negative 9, which would be negative 1, plus 13, so then you're at 12, plus negative 15, you still get negative 3. Another property that we have is called the additive identity. So additive inverse was when you add opposites and you get a 0. Additive identity is when you add 0 to anything. It doesn't change the number. So 2 plus 0 is 2. Something like that. So negative 2 plus 0 is going to be negative 2. 5 plus negative 5 would be what? 0. How about number 3? 1 and the last one? Negative 2.